Black Hollow, 1892. Let me tell you what awaits. In the misty hills of the Missouri Ozarks, where shadows grow long and the earth keeps its secrets, there lived a woman whose name still haunts the hollows. The year was 1892, and the place was Black Hollow, a remote settlement carved from wilderness so unforgiving that even the most hardened souls found themselves whispering prayers into the dark. This is the macabre story of Moira Blackthorne, known to the locals as the Mountain Witch, whose curse still lives beyond the veil of time. Listen closely. In the autumn of that year, a traveling journalist named Samuel Hartwell arrived in Black Hollow to investigate a series of unexplained deaths. What he discovered was far more sinister than any tale he had ever chronicled. The hook is stark. Every person who had crossed Moira Blackthorne had met a fate so terrible that the very mention of her name made grown men cross themselves and turn away. The truth was far darker than any folklore could prepare them for. Black Hollow itself was a place born from desperation. Nestled deep within the Ozark Mountains, accessible only by treacherous mountain paths, it had attracted those seeking to disappear from the world. The settlement consisted of a few dozen log cabins scattered around a central clearing, with a general store, a small church, and a tavern that served as the community's heart. The residents were a mix of former slaves seeking freedom, war veterans, and drifters looking for a fresh start. But beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful community lurked an ancient evil. Moira Blackthorne had arrived in Black Hollow 15 years earlier, a mysterious woman with knowledge of herbs and healing that seemed almost supernatural. She lived alone in a cabin on the far edge of the settlement, surrounded by a garden filled with plants that no one could identify. The locals respected her distance, grateful for her healing abilities, but they also feared her in a way they couldn't quite articulate. The first sign that something was wrong came when the town's children began having nightmares. They spoke of a woman in black who visited them in their dreams, whispering words in a language that made their parents' blood run cold. Then, the livestock started dying in ways that defied explanation. Animals were found with their throats cut in precise patterns, arranged in strange formations that suggested ritualistic purpose. The local doctor, a man named James Whitmore, was baffled by the precision of the cuts and the apparent knowledge of anatomy required to make them. If stories like this grip you, please like the video and subscribe so you don't miss what the records reveal next. The arrival of Samuel Hartwell in Black Hollow was not entirely coincidental. The journalist had been following reports of strange occurrences in remote Ozark settlements for months, but Black Hollow had remained particularly elusive in the press. Most reporters avoided the area due to its reputation for hostility toward outsiders. But Hartwell was different. He had a particular interest in supernatural folklore and had made a name for himself by investigating cases that others deemed too dangerous or too bizarre to pursue. What nobody knew was that Hartwell had a personal connection to the area. His younger brother had vanished in the Ozarks 3 years earlier while researching a story about local legends. The official report claimed that Thomas Hartwell had simply disappeared while exploring the wilderness, but Samuel had always suspected something more sinister. The timing of the recent deaths in Black Hollow, which coincided with the anniversary of his brother's disappearance, was too convenient to ignore. Moira Blackthorne had lived in Black Hollow for 15 years, but her origins remained a mystery. The older residents remembered her arrival like it was yesterday, a tall, gaunt woman with piercing green eyes who appeared from the forest as if she had grown from the earth itself. She spoke with an accent that suggested European origins, though she never specified which country. Her knowledge of herbs and healing was extensive, bordering on the impossible, and she seemed to possess an understanding of human anatomy that went far beyond what any layperson should know. The woman's cabin stood on the far edge of the settlement, isolated from the other homes by a dense grove of oak and hickory trees. It was a modest structure, built from logs that had been precisely cut and fitted together with a skill that suggested professional craftsmanship. The cabin's windows were always covered with heavy curtains, and smoke rarely rose from its chimney, which struck the locals as odd for someone who lived alone in the Ozark wilderness. Moira's garden was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of her property. The plants that grew there were unlike anything the locals had ever seen. Some resembled familiar herbs, but with twisted stalks and leaves that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural color. Others were completely foreign, with flowers that bloomed in impossible colors and emitted scents that made observers feel dizzy and disoriented. The woman was often seen tending to these plants in the early morning hours, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost otherworldly. The first death that linked directly to Moira Blackthorne occurred in the spring of 1891. A young man named Jacob Miller had been caught stealing vegetables from her garden and was found the next morning with his throat cut in the same precise pattern that had been observed in the livestock. The local doctor, James Whitmore, noted that the cut was made with surgical precision, suggesting the killer had extensive knowledge of anatomy. When questioned, Moira claimed she had no knowledge of the theft or the subsequent death, though several witnesses reported seeing her in the area around the time of the incident. The townspeople were divided in their response to this first murder. Some demanded that Moira be arrested and brought to justice, while others argued that Miller had brought his fate upon himself by trespassing. The town council ultimately decided to warn the woman to keep to herself and to avoid any confrontations with the residents. This decision would prove to be a grave mistake, as it only emboldened Moira to act more boldly in the months that followed. As summer turned to autumn in 1891, more deaths occurred. Each victim had somehow crossed Moira Blackthorne, whether through direct confrontation, spreading rumors about her activities, or simply being in her way at the wrong moment. The precision of the killing suggested a methodical mind at work, someone who understood both human psychology and anatomy in ways that defied explanation. Samuel Hartwell's investigation into the deaths in Black Hollow began with interviews of the surviving residents. What he discovered was a community paralyzed by fear, where people whispered about Moira Blackthorne as if speaking her name aloud might summon her wrath. The journalist's first interview was with the town's doctor, James Whitmore, a man whose medical expertise had made him the unofficial coroner for the settlement. Dr. Whitmore was a nervous man in his 50s, with graying hair and hands that trembled slightly as he spoke. He had performed autopsies on all of the victims, and his findings were consistent and disturbing. Each death had been caused by a single, precise cut to the throat that severed the carotid artery. The wounds were clean, surgical in their precision, and showed knowledge of human anatomy that suggested the killer had formal medical training. This detail troubled Hartwell, as it implied that Moira Blackthorne might have had experience in a field that was virtually closed to women in the 1890s. The doctor also revealed information that had not been widely shared with the townspeople. Each victim had been found with a small, carved wooden token placed in their hand, a symbol that Dr. Whitmore could not identify but that seemed to have personal significance to the killer. The tokens were made from a dark wood that appeared almost black and were carved with intricate patterns that resembled ancient script. When Hartwell examined the tokens, he noticed that they were identical, suggesting they had been made by the same hand. Hartwell's next interview was with Margaret O'Sullivan, a widow who had lived in Black Hollow for nearly 20 years. She had been one of the first settlers and remembered Moira's arrival with unusual clarity. According to Margaret, the mysterious woman had appeared during a particularly harsh winter, walking out of the forest on a night when the temperature had dropped below zero. She had been dressed in a long black coat that seemed to absorb light, and her breath had not created any vapor despite the freezing air. Margaret claimed that Moira had spoken to her in a language that sounded like Latin but was not quite the same. When the woman had finally spoken in English, her accent had been difficult to place, not quite European, but not American either. She had requested permission to build a cabin on the edge of the settlement, offering to provide healing services in exchange for the right to live apart from the other residents. The town council had agreed, seeing her offer as beneficial to the community. The widow also shared a disturbing detail that had been omitted from the official records. Before the first murder, several residents had reported seeing lights in Moira's cabin during the night, lights that seemed to pulse and shift in patterns that defied explanation. These lights had been observed on nights when no fire burned in the cabin's fireplace, and they had seemed to move in deliberate formations across the walls. When the residents had investigated, they found nothing unusual, but the phenomenon had continued intermittently for months. Hartwell's investigation took a darker turn when he discovered that his brother Thomas had been asking similar questions about Moira Blackthorne before his disappearance. According to the tavern keeper, Thomas had spent several evenings drinking and talking about the woman's mysterious background. He had mentioned finding strange symbols carved into trees around the settlement, symbols that matched the patterns on the wooden tokens found with the victims. The journalist realized that his brother had been getting close to the truth, and that his disappearance was likely connected to his investigation into Moira's activities. This connection made Hartwell's own situation more dangerous, as he was now following the same path that had led to Thomas's vanishing. But rather than turning back, Hartwell felt a renewed determination to uncover the truth about the mountain witch of Black Hollow. As he continued his research, Hartwell discovered that Moira Blackthorne had left behind a trail of similar incidents in other remote locations throughout the American frontier. Records from newspaper archives in Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky all contained reports of mysterious deaths that matched the same pattern: precise throat cuts, wooden tokens, and a woman with unusual knowledge of herbs and anatomy. Each time, the incidents had stopped when the community had grown too suspicious, and the woman had simply vanished, only to reappear years later in another isolated settlement. As Hartwell delved deeper into the mystery of Moira Blackthorne, he began to uncover evidence that challenged everything he thought he knew about the woman. The newspaper archives from other frontier settlements painted a picture of a figure who had been active for far longer than the 15 years she had spent in Black Hollow. According to these records, a woman matching Moira's description had appeared in various remote locations across the American frontier, always under a different name, but with the same pattern of mysterious deaths following in her wake. The earliest record Hartwell could find dated back to 1853 in the mountains of Virginia, where a woman calling herself Marguerite Thorne had provided healing services to a small settlement before the residents began dying in the same precise manner that was now occurring in Black Hollow. The pattern was identical: surgical throat cuts, wooden tokens placed with the victims, and strange lights observed in the healer's dwelling. When the community had grown suspicious, the woman had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and the lingering fear that something inhuman had walked among them. Hartwell's research revealed that this pattern had repeated itself across the frontier over the course of 40 years. In 1861, a woman named Maria Torino had provided medical assistance to gold miners in California before a similar string of deaths occurred. In 1872, a healer called Mary Blackstone had settled in a remote Montana territory, only to leave behind a trail of precisely killed victims when the authorities began to close in. Each time, the woman had adapted to the local customs and needs, but the method of her killings remained unchanged. What was most disturbing about these records was the implication that Maria Blackthorne was not aging. The descriptions of the woman in 1853 were identical to the woman who currently lived in Black Hollow. Her physical characteristics, her manner of speech, her knowledge of herbs and medicine, everything remained consistent across decades that should have visibly aged any normal human being. This revelation sent chills through Hartwell as he began to understand that he was not dealing with a mere murderer, but with something far more ancient and malevolent. The journalist's investigation took an unexpected turn when he discovered that his brother Thomas had been researching the same pattern before his disappearance. In Thomas's abandoned belongings, which had been stored in the tavern's attic, Hartwell found detailed notes and sketches of the wooden tokens. His brother had made connections between the symbols and ancient texts he had studied, suggesting that they were not random carvings, but part of a ritualistic practice that stretched back centuries. Thomas's notes indicated that he had identified the symbols as resembling ancient Celtic and pre-Celtic markings, possibly related to Druidic practices. He had theorized that Moira Blackthorne was not merely a killer, but a practitioner of ancient and forbidden form of magic that required human sacrifice to maintain her unnatural longevity. The precise nature of the throat cuts suggested a ritualistic component, as did the placement of the tokens with each victim. Hartwell realized that his brother had likely confronted Moira directly, believing he had uncovered the truth about her nature. This confrontation had resulted in Thomas's disappearance, just as similar confrontations had ended in death for other residents of Black Hollow who had gotten too close to the truth. The journalist understood that he was now in the same position as his brother, and that Moira would likely see him as a threat that needed to be eliminated. If this careful middle chapter is earning your trust, please tap like and subscribe, small actions that let us keep telling long stories the patient way. As Hartwell continued his research, he discovered that the wooden tokens were not just random symbols, but formed part of a larger pattern. When arranged in a specific configuration, the symbols seemed to create a map of some kind, pointing toward a location deep in the Ozark wilderness. This location, according to Thomas's notes, was where Moira Blackthorne had first arrived in the region and where she had likely established the foundation of her dark practices. Hartwell's discovery of the symbolic map hidden within the wooden tokens marked a turning point in his investigation. Working by candlelight in the tavern's common room, he carefully arranged the tokens he had photographed from Thomas's notes. As he positioned each carved piece according to the patterns his brother had identified, a clear image began to emerge, a topographical representation of the Ozark wilderness surrounding Black Hollow, with specific landmarks marked by the intricate symbols. The map revealed that the locations of the murders in Black Hollow were not random, but formed a ritualistic pattern, a kind of sigil drawn in blood across the landscape. Each death had occurred at a point that corresponded to specific symbols on the carved tokens, creating a larger design that stretched across several miles of mountain terrain. This revelation suggested that Moira Blackthorne was not simply killing for personal satisfaction or to eliminate threats to her secret, but was performing an elaborate ritual that required specific locations and precise methods of sacrifice. Following the map's guidance, Hartwell realized that the ritual was incomplete. There were still several points marked on the symbolic representation that had not yet been activated by death. According to Thomas's notes, which referenced ancient texts on Celtic and pre-Celtic practices, the completion of such a ritual would grant the practitioner power over life and death itself. The precise throat cuts were not merely a method of killing, but a specific requirement for the ritual, designed to release the victim's life force in a controlled manner. The journalist understood with growing horror that he was witnessing the final stages of a centuries-old ritual that Moira Blackthorne had been performing across the American frontier. Each time she had been forced to move to a new location, she had started the ritual anew, slowly building toward its completion. Black Hollow represented the culmination of decades of preparation, a place where she had finally found enough isolated victims to complete her dark work. Hartwell's investigation led him to examine the historical records of Black Hollow more carefully, searching for any mention of the area's original inhabitants. What he discovered was deeply disturbing. The settlement had been built on land that had been considered sacred by the local Osage people, a place they had avoided for generations due to its association with dark spiritual forces. According to tribal records that had been preserved by a sympathetic missionary, the area had been the site of ancient rituals that predated European settlement by centuries. The Osage accounts described a presence that fed on human suffering and grew stronger with each act of violence committed within its domain. They had warned that any who disturbed the balance of the sacred place would become servants of this ancient evil, bound to feed it with fresh sacrifices. The missionaries had dismissed these accounts as primitive superstition, but Hartwell began to wonder if the Osage had been describing the very entity that Moira Blackthorne had somehow learned to serve or control. As he pieced together this information, Hartwell realized that the Mountain Witch of Black Hollow was not acting alone, but was part of a larger, more ancient conspiracy. The woman's longevity, her knowledge of herbs and anatomy, and her ability to appear in different locations while maintaining her youthful appearance all suggested that she was not human in any conventional sense. She might be something far older and more dangerous, a servant or avatar of the ancient evil that had always inhabited this cursed place. The journalist's research also revealed that the ritual described in Thomas's notes required 7 specific deaths arranged in a particular sequence to reach its climax. 6 of these deaths had already occurred in Black Hollow, each one taking place at a location marked on the symbolic map. The 7th death, according to the pattern, would need to occur at the ritual's focal point, a location marked on the map as the heart of the hollow, a place deep in the wilderness where the ancient Osage had believed the veil between worlds was thinnest. Hartwell understood that he had stumbled into the final act of a centuries-old horror, and that Moira Blackthorne would stop at nothing to complete her ritual. The journalist was now not only investigating a series of murders, but was potentially the key to preventing something far worse from being unleashed upon the world. The question was whether he could act quickly enough to stop the Mountain Witch before she claimed her final victim and completed the ritual that would grant her ultimate power over life and death. The night that Hartwell discovered the true scope of Moira Blackthorne's ritual was the night that the Mountain Witch finally decided to act against him directly. As he studied the symbolic map in the tavern's common room, the temperature in the building began to drop despite the blazing fire in the hearth. The candles flickered and dimmed, though there was no wind to disturb them, and the shadows on the walls began to move independently of their sources. Hartwell looked up from Thomas's notes to find Moira Blackthorne standing in the doorway of the tavern, her tall, gaunt figure silhouetted against the darkness beyond. Her piercing green eyes seemed to glow with an inner light, and her presence filled the room with an oppressive atmosphere that made it difficult to breathe. The woman who had lived as a recluse on the edge of Black Hollow had finally revealed herself as something far more dangerous than any human killer. "You have been asking too many questions, Mr. Hartwell," Moira said, her voice carrying an accent that seemed to shift between European languages with each word. "You have been looking in places where no outsider should peer. My patience with your kind has reached its end." The Mountain Witch stepped into the room, and as she did, the remaining candles extinguished themselves one by one, leaving only the dying embers of the fire to provide illumination. The journalist realized with growing terror that he was face to face with not just a murderer, but with an entity that had been feeding on human suffering for centuries. The woman before him was no longer trying to hide her true nature. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that seemed to shift and change in the dim light, and her fingers ended in nails that were far too long and sharp to be natural. The supernatural being that had used the name Moira Blackthorne had finally dropped the pretense of humanity. Hartwell attempted to flee, but found that his legs would not obey his commands. The mountain witch had trapped him with some form of supernatural paralysis, rendering him helpless as she approached. "You seek to understand what has occurred in this place," she said, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in frequencies beyond human hearing. "You wish to know the truth about my longevity, my knowledge, my power. Very well. I shall show you the truth, though it will be the last thing you ever comprehend." The room around them began to shift and change, the walls becoming transparent as visions of the past flooded Hartwell's consciousness. He saw the land as it had been centuries before, when the Osage people had performed their own dark rituals in the same location. He witnessed the arrival of the entity that Moira served, a presence of pure malevolence that had been drawn to the area by the suffering and death that had been inflicted upon the land. He saw how the entity had slowly corrupted and transformed human practitioners over the centuries, using them as vessels and servants to continue its work. The vision showed Hartwell how Moira had not always been the creature she was now. She had once been a human woman, a healer in a small European village in the 15th century. But when plague had devastated her community, she had made a desperate bargain with the entity that fed on suffering, trading her humanity for the power to save others. The bargain had been a trap. The entity had used her as a tool to spread the plague further, feeding on the resulting death and despair while slowly transforming her into something inhuman. The ritual that was nearly complete in Black Hollow was not just about gaining power over life and death. It was about opening a permanent gateway between the world of the living and the realm of the entity that Moira served. Once completed, this gateway would allow the ancient evil to spread beyond the confines of the Ozark wilderness, bringing death and suffering to the entire world. The mountain witch had spent centuries preparing for this moment, moving from settlement to settlement, gathering the necessary components for the ritual. Hartwell understood now that he was not just another victim of the mountain witch's killing spree. He was the final component needed to complete the ritual, an educated man of knowledge who could understand the true nature of what was happening, whose fear and realization would add the final element required to open the gateway. The entity that had been feeding on the Ozarks for centuries was about to break free of its earthly prison, and there seemed to be nothing that could stop it. But as Moira Blackthorne prepared to complete her centuries-long ritual with Hartwell as the final component, something unexpected happened. The journalist, despite being paralyzed by supernatural forces, remembered his brother Thomas's final words, which had been scrawled in the margins of his research notes. Thomas had written about an ancient Osage ritual designed to banish the very entity that Moira served, a ceremony that could potentially break the connection between the supernatural being and its human vessel. With tremendous effort, fighting against the supernatural paralysis that held him, Hartwell managed to reach into his coat pocket and retrieve a small piece of paper on which Thomas had copied the Osage incantation. The words were written in the original Osage language alongside their English translation. Chihe wazute wahase, hikona chihe wazute. The translation read, "The old spirits return, the false spirit departs." As Hartwell began to speak the ancient words, the room filled with a brilliant light that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. The mountain witch recoiled in horror, her inhuman form beginning to waver and flicker as if she were being pulled apart by competing forces. The entity that had inhabited her for centuries was being severed from its host, and the connection that had sustained both the witch and the creature began to unravel. Moira's true form began to emerge from behind the supernatural mask she had worn for so long. The gaunt, gray-skinned creature was revealed to be an ancient human woman, so old that her bones seemed ready to crumble to dust. Her flesh had been preserved by dark magic for centuries, but as the ritual was interrupted, the true extent of her age became apparent. She was not a supernatural being at all, but a human who had been twisted and corrupted by her long servitude to the entity from beyond. The entity itself, now separated from its human vessel, took on a form that defied human comprehension, a writhing mass of shadow and malice that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. It shrieked with a sound that transcended the normal range of human hearing, and the windows of the tavern began to crack from the force of its rage. But the Osage ritual was working, and the creature was being drawn back to whatever realm it had originally come from. As the entity was banished back to its own dimension, the supernatural paralysis holding Hartwell released its grip. The journalist collapsed to the floor, exhausted but alive, as the mountain witch's cabin on the edge of Black Hollow burst into flames in the distance. The fire burned with an otherworldly intensity, consuming not just the physical structure, but the dark energies that had been bound to it for decades. The remaining residents of Black Hollow found Hartwell in the tavern at dawn, unconscious but alive. Moira Blackthorne and her cabin had vanished completely, leaving behind only a patch of scorched earth where her home had stood. The wooden tokens that had marked her victims were found scattered throughout the settlement, their power finally broken. Samuel Hartwell survived to write about his experience, though he never fully recovered from what he had witnessed. He spent the rest of his life researching supernatural phenomena and ancient protective rituals, always searching for ways to prevent other entities from taking root in the world of the living. His brother Thomas's notes, which had contained the key to their salvation, were preserved and passed down to other researchers, who continued the fight against the ancient evils that still lurked in remote corners of the world. The settlement of Black Hollow was eventually abandoned, as the remaining residents could not forget what had occurred there. But the story did not end with the destruction of Moira Blackthorne. Travelers still report strange lights in the Ozark wilderness, and some claim to have seen a figure in black watching from the forest edge. The curse of Black Hollow may have been broken, but the land still holds memories of the evil that once dwelled there, waiting for those foolish enough to disturb its ancient slumber. The truth about the Mountain Witch of Black Hollow serves as a reminder that some forces in this world are far older and more malevolent than humanity realizes. The Ozark wilderness keeps its secrets well, but those who venture too deep into its shadows may still encounter remnants of the dark power that once called Black Hollow home. The macabre history of the Mountain Witch stands as a testament to the thin veil between our world and the realms of pure malevolence that seek to consume it. When Hartwell finally set aside legend long enough to inventory facts, the story became stranger and clearer at once. He drew a map of Black Hollow with pencil stubs, cabins, the spring, the ridge path, Moira's garden fenced in with woven branches. He marked dates beside doors, where quarrels had turned into illnesses and illnesses into funerals. The pattern refused melodrama. There were no midnight chases, only quiet separations, neighbors who stopped visiting after a dispute, men who woke with a taste of iron in their mouths, a midwife who would not step across one threshold again and would not say why. Moira's garden, which had been a place of medicine for years, looked different to a man hunting for causes. Foxglove near the door could mean tinctures for weak hearts. It could also mean mistakes with doses. Nightshade at the fence line might be pest control. It might be a caution. Boneset, pennyroyal, rue. Each plant walked a line between remedy and harm depending on knowledge and intent. Hartwell's notes tried to remain neutral. The margins betrayed him with adjectives like uncanny and deliberate. He was a journalist, not a botanist. He borrowed certainty where he should have borrowed books. Black Hollow's ledgers told adjacent stories. The store account showed a run on salt and tallow the week after a large animal was found dead at the creek. The church minutes recorded a motion to discontinue dusk services for the winter, though the vote happened in harvest. The physician's log, thin, brittle, contained a page torn neatly away where one might expect a record of a particular fever. These absences were doings as surely as any entry, but they resisted being added up. In places like Black Hollow, silence was both custom and currency. When the sheriff from the county seat finally climbed the path with 2 deputies, he found a town disciplined by fear and politeness. No one accused Moira outright. Everyone described the shape of a shadow. The sheriff, to his credit, asked for object, place, time. He walked with Hartwell to the garden and kept his hands behind his back, as if not touching could prevent him from being accused of introducing what he had come to find. In his report, still legible where rain did not blur it, he wrote a sentence more honest than most. "We are inclined by rumor and constrained by proof." At Moira's cabin there were jars labeled in a tidy hand and bundles of plants hanging by the rafters. A mortar held stains that could have been from 100 lawful preparations. A kettle smelled of mint. In a box under the bed, folded and refolded, a letter from a sister in Kentucky asked after Moira's practice, and warned against men who wanted medicine to obey their reputations. The sheriff noted the letter and returned it to its place. Whatever else he was not a fool about optics. If there was a turning point, it was not a discovery but a decision. A young man named Abel, whose brother had died after a fight over a fence line, spoke more plainly than anyone had yet dared. He did not name poison, he named neglect, neighbors who let quarrels harden, a church that preferred mutters to mediation, a doctor who guarded knowledge like property. She is a woman with jars, he said, and we are a town that likes excuses. The sentence made the minutes. It did not make the broadsides. What then of the witch? Historians who have walked the hollow a century later carry two ledgers in their packs. In the first, receipts for herbs, baptismal lists, a sheriff's report with rain-streaked ink, a journalist's notebook salted with drama. In the second, the things paper cannot hold. Mothers warning daughters not to accept tea in certain houses, a hymn altered so that a verse about deliverance becomes a verse about doors left open, a custom of leaving bread on a fence post after a quarrel as a ceasefire. In the first ledger, Moira Blackthorne is a healer, whose practice overlapped peril and possibility. In the second, she is a screen onto which a community projected grievance until the picture stuck. The cautious reading does not deny harm, it situates it. A settlement that prized self-reliance, asked a woman to be medicine, then punished her when medicine failed to behave like certainty. A minister who scolded from the pulpit, rather than visiting men on their porches, let doctrine do work that conversation should have done. A doctor jealous of expertise he had paid in coin to earn, let patients become parables about the dangers of folk remedies, instead of neighbors who needed two minds working together. In that arrangement, a winter with 3 unlucky deaths needs only one rumor to calcify into a curse. There were, of course, darker possibilities: deliberate dosing, experiments with strong teas given under the cover of piety, the quiet settling of scores by a woman whose life had given her few conventional instruments of leverage. The archive does not acquit, it refuses to convict cleanly. The only honest sentence is that Black Hollow built a story that kept it upright. Whether Moira authored that story, co-authored it with fear, or had it written onto her by men who needed a villain, depends on which piece of paper you privilege and which silences you honor. Our ethic, as ever, is restraint without naivete. We will not detail bodies to earn your attention. We will name systems that disposed of them casually. We will not repeat incantations said to have been overheard through keyholes. We will trace how property, gender, and isolation make any place vulnerable to convenient myths. We will not tell you whether Moira was a witch. We will tell you why Black Hollow needed one. A practical coda for those who live in small places with long memories. Keep quarrels small by interrupting them early. Do not let a fence line teach theology. Share knowledge sideways. Doctors and herbalists sitting at the same table make fewer ghosts. Put names, not shadows, into minutes when you can bear it. Rumor fattens in vagueness. When a story explains everything, ask which difficulties it saves you from facing. If careful, source-grounded work that resists spectacle is worth your time, you know what to do. Subscribe and share. Attention funds the slow labor of reading both ledgers at once.